Thank you so much for joining our meeting today on the critical intersections of FGMC, the value of intersectionality in cross-collaboration. My name is Shirley Liu. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And if you're not familiar with our work and what we do, just very briefly, we are a national resource center on gender-based violence that affects Asian American, Pacific Islander communities in the United States and its territories. We are not a direct service provider, but we do advocacy, research, policy engagement, and other forms of work addressing gender-based violence in these communities. And we're super excited to be offering this meeting today with Sayo on FGMC, really raising awareness and educating around how it is a form of gender-based violence, and it is something that needs attention, and that we need to work together in intersectional ways to eliminate and to address in our communities. So I'm just gonna cut my introduction super short because I'm sure you're all more interested in hearing from our presenters today. But very quickly, the webinar meeting is going to be recorded, and feel free to be sending that out, the link out, to anybody you know who would be interested who missed the session today. We want to keep it very interactive, so feel free to use the chat box and share any questions you have, any reflections, and any thoughts. And with that, I'll just turn it over to our presenters. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Shirley. I'm super glad to be here. I do want to apologize in advance if you all can hear the construction noise in the background. I'm enjoying this lovely courtyard today. So let's just focus on the tree. But as Shirley said, we are here to discuss Sayo's original research for the Critical Intersections Research Project, which highlights intersectionality and the intersectional approach to ending FGMC. And today we will be focusing on the aspect of cross-collaboration that we learned about through our original research. We will begin with an introduction of Sayo, of FGMC, including a definition and the context of the practice domestically and globally. From there, we'll look at intersectionality as a framework and the webinar that inspired this project. Next, we'll examine the findings from the report with a focus on challenges as well as opportunities around collaboration. We'll provide a case study example of cross-sector collaboration and programming, and then open up our time for discussion around your own experiences with collaboration and intersectional approaches. We'll leave you with next steps for the project as well as resources from Sayo before giving you all the opportunity to ask any questions. And before I jump in, just a quick hello. My name is Rachel Wine. I am Sayo's research coordinator as well as the lead on this Critical Intersections research project. I'm super grateful to Shirley as well as API-GBV for inviting me to be here, and looking forward to sharing this research. I would also like to shout out Aisha Dorley, one of Sayo's research volunteers, for supporting this presentation today. And thank you to those who have introduced themselves in the chat box. I encourage all of those who are joining to introduce yourselves as well. And with that said, let's dive in. Next slide, Aisha. So a little background on Sayo. The organization was formed in 2015 as an advocacy collective of South Asian and other survivors of FGMC, which is female genital mutilation or cutting, to address the lack of acknowledgement around FGMC as a global form of gender-based violence as well as child abuse. And we utilize collaborative grassroots campaigns and storytelling techniques to train members of FGMC practicing communities in leading the demand for widespread abandonment, work with frontline professionals such as healthcare providers to create culturally sensitive systems of care for survivors, and partner with government officials to address policy level change. Next slide. So after polling the registrants for this event, we thought it might be helpful to provide some background on FGMC. As you can see, the World Health Organization's definition of FGMC includes that the practice is not for medical reasons, and this certainly contributes to the growing international recognition around this topic, particularly as a human rights violation, as well as an extreme a form of violence against women and girls. And it is a practice that generally occurs on minors, anywhere from birth to puberty. In some circumstances, it does occur to adult women. The World Health Organization also outlines 4 major categories of FGC. Type 1 is the removal of the clitoral hood with or without the removal of part or all of the clitoris. Type 2 is partial or total removal of the clitoris and the labia minora with or without the removal or part all of the labia majora. Type 3, which is also referred to as infibulation, is the narrowing of the vaginal orifice, usually by creating a seal. And this often involves cutting and repositioning the labia minora, labia majora, and sometimes the clitoris as well. There's also type 4, which is kind of the catch-all for other forms, which include pricking, piercing, and cauterizing. So we definitely want to acknowledge that FGMC is not a standardized practice and that these are just broad categories used as a point of reference. But with the diversity in cultures that practice a form of FGMC, the practice can manifest in many different ways. FGMC might be referred to by different names, and the severity and trauma one experiences may also vary. Additionally, we want to acknowledge that despite the name for the practice, not everyone who has undergone FGMC may identify as female. However, in this presentation, we use gendered terminology mainly for descriptive purposes. Nonetheless, especially as this was documented throughout our research, we believe it is essential to emphasize that the experiences of survivors encompass a wide range of identities. Short-term complications of FGMC can include hemorrhage, difficulty urinating and menstruating, infections, just to name a few. Some chronic and long-term issues can include cyst formation, frequent UTIs, sexual dysfunction, infertility, and complications in childbirth. Despite the potential consequences just mentioned, it is not unusual for women to feel that their experience with FGMC was not harmful to them. And a part of that is due to the fact that FGMC is usually performed between birth and puberty. So oftentimes women are unaware of the connection between their health issues and FGMC. However, FGMC is a traumatic event that often results in mental health challenges for survivors, which is a quote unquote invisible but crucial part of survivor support as well as healing. Next slide. So to contextualize FGMC domestically, in 2012, the CDC estimated that over 500,000 women and girls in the US had FGMC performed on them or were at risk of FGMC. And this is an important finding, as it indicates a 3-fold increase from a 1997 estimate. Unfortunately, this estimate does not factor in those who were born in the US, such as second and third generation immigrants, individuals who don't identify as female, and more who have experienced FGMC. Therefore, we recognize this is most likely an underrepresentation of the population at risk. And nonetheless, having this broad picture, we have an idea of what that prevalence looks like in some states throughout the US. With our map on the left, highlighted in the darker shade of orange, are states identified as having more than 25,000 women and girls at risk for FGC. The map on the right shows the 41 states that have passed laws against FGC, many of which were passed in the last 5 years, with the most recent law having passed a year ago this month by Washington State Governor Jay Inslee. Now, the provisions of these laws vary by state. Only a few, less than 10, have provisions that require local community education and outreach programs regarding FGC. And of those states, very few have actually implemented those provisions. All of that to say that policy and legislation on FGMC is not all that ends well, for lack of better word, sophisticated in the US as it may be for other forms of GBV. Next slide. It's also important to emphasize that FGMC is a global practice, particularly when understanding that the cultural diversity and nuances attached to the experiences of those impact very greatly. We wanted to take a moment to delve into some of the current statistics, given that it really is only in the last few years that the UN has recognized FGMC as an international public health issue. In 2020, a report conducted by 3 NGOs, which are shown at the bottom of the map, revealed FGMC can be found in at least 92 countries around the world. However, according to a newly released UNICEF report, the global figure is 230 million women and girls, and this accounts for only about 32 countries, primarily in Africa and the Middle East. This updated global estimate shows a 15% increase in the total number of survivors, compared to data released 8 years ago, which estimated 200 million girls and women have undergone FGMC. The limitations in data collection we see is in part a result of international policies, such as the Millennium Development Goals, which only required that they considered quote unquote relevant countries to collect data. There was a lot of advocacy from those working in the field of FGMC to have that policy changed. And in 2015, with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, all countries were required to report on FGMC. Regrettably, for countless women and girls residing in regions not initially considered relevant, this meant enduring the hardships of FGMC without international recognition or support. Additionally, some of the tools and methods used to collect data, including the general silence around this issue, lead us to believe that current estimates do not accurately portray the number of women and girls affected or at risk of FGMC. So that is a background on FGMC before we launch into our research. Next slide. And as this research focuses on both FGMC and intersectionality, I wanted to take some time before launching into the findings to ask you all the question, what is intersectionality? Please feel free to answer in the chat box or come off mute. We'll just take a couple minutes.
I can jump in. Hi, I'm Dr. Shobana Powell, she, her pronouns. I think of intersectionality as overlapping identities that historically or currently experience oppression or marginalization. So I see it as not just the intersection of our multiple different types of identities, but then how that impacts the way the world sees us, the way we navigate systems, the way we navigate the world, our barriers as well as our strengths. Yeah, I'll say that that'll be my summary.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. And Renee, I saw that you left an answer in the chat box, the intersection of FGMC and other gender abuses. Would anyone else like to contribute before we move on? All right, I think we can move to the next slide then. So from our initial scoping review, which was the first stage of this research project, we found that intersectionality made the most sense to us as a framework that could be applied to both activism as well as everyday human interaction. As you can see here, it was first introduced by the Combahee River Collective, defined as multiple interlocking systems of political identities and racial, sexual, and patriarchal oppression. And then Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw developed and codified the framework of intersectionality to understand the consequences of treating different social oppressions as mutually exclusive experiences, such as race and gender. And so what the big takeaway from this is that identity does not exist in a vacuum. Each of us is a unique mosaic comprised of different pieces that create a complex whole, which is greater than the sum of its parts. And in the context of social justice work, no form of oppression exists in a vacuum. Everything is connected. Next slide. So keeping this in mind as we dive into the project and how we explore intersectionality, I first wanted to share a clip from the inspiration behind this project. Next slide. So in July of 2021, SAO hosted a webinar called Critical Intersections, Anti-Racism and Female Genital Mutilation/Cutting, in which anti-FGMC activists engaged in a conversation to elevate understanding of how systems of racism operate in and negatively impact the work to end FGMC. In this clip, you'll see panelist Aisata MB Kamara speaking on the necessity of intersectional approaches to survivor support. By uplifting this approach, Aisata gave way to the idea and question of, would collaboration between FGMC and racial justice movements make sense or be possible? And that is absolutely a huge part of how our research began. So Aisha, you can play the clip and it'll just end when the section is done.
So we're not able to hear any sound. There should be sound, right?
Have to fight one issue at a time.
Can you
and
hear it
that
now?
adding FGM maybe to Black Lives Matter issues dilutes it, and then it takes away the attention. And I've had conversations with a lot of activists, and I think that what we have to realize that these issues have to be addressed at the same time, right? And if you as a leader of a movement cannot address it, then bring someone along that could help in addressing it. But the idea of erasing it from the discussion, I think really lessens the work, but then it also really segment certain communities, because I am a Black woman, but I am also a survivor of female genital mutilation. So when you're asking me to differentiate those two, you're really leaving me still having my needs unanswered. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation and say that we all have to work together, and we all have to try and make sure that we address these issues. And that's part of the mentality, right? We've been told that we could only get one of our needs met at a time, and we have to say, F that, we could actually get all of our needs met, and you have to listen to what we have to do. And we're not going to wait for you to solve it for us. We're going to solve it for ourselves. Thanks.
Awesome. Next slide. So these powerful words from Aisata were definitely a huge source of inspiration for our Critical Intersections research project. And based on the popularity of that webinar, we decided to embark on original research to further examine the topic. And we developed the following research questions to guide our study. How has systemic racism delayed substantial change on the issue of meeting progress toward achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goal to end FGMC by 2030? And are there possible connections to other movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter that come into play? After performing a scoping review as the first phase of our research to learn about the current understanding of FGMC and intersectionality, we found that there were many more factors beyond systemic racism that hinder survivors and activists. After learning about 7 overarching themes that interacted with FGMC, ranging from queer, gender, and sexuality to climate change, we developed a mixed method survey to gain a deeper understanding into the forms of discrimination affecting survivors and activists, as well as challenges and opportunities for cross-collaboration with other movements. Next slide. Which leads us to our findings. So instead of launching straight into our data, I'm hoping to bring all of your insights into the fold. And as activists, frontline professionals, members of the DVSA, gender-based violence spheres and beyond, next slide. Which forms of oppression are you seeing in your work, and how do they manifest? Again, please feel free to come off of mute or provide your answers in the chat box. All right, I think, oh. So Lorena says, I'm in the military and the power struggle is still real. And Renee says that patriarchal domination of women by men and racial discrimination. These are both really potent examples and things that we definitely saw in our research. Did anyone else want to share? Let's see, intersections of gender-based violence with homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, racism, sexism, ableism, discrimination based on language, caste, socioeconomic status. Yep. All right, well, thank you all so much for sharing. Next slide. So in this section, we'll summarize 2 different groupings of oppression that we created based on data from survey participants, systemic forces of discrimination and interpersonal/communal forces of discrimination. These oppressive forces affect both the movement to end FGMC on a larger scale as well as survivors on an individual scale, and they range from patriarchal influence in practicing communities to the intersection of racism in law and policy. And you can see some of the themes listed here on the slide. If you are interested in learning more about that specifically, I definitely encourage you all to read the report. Next slide. So starting with systemic forces, I find this quote from a survey respondent to be particularly relevant to our approach with this research. There needs to be attention to intersectional identities and relationship that continue to threaten FGMC-affected communities along the lines of migration, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, class, age, etc. Some of the themes are touched on here, including race, migration, gender, and religion. So some of the highlights from this section include racialized language around FGMC, which is often weaponized against Black communities. This can include use of words like barbaric, as well as the association with FGMC or different types of FGMC with African communities as a way to differentiate. This is often based in racism as a way to justify other forms of FGMC occurring in other communities. Fear of deportation, family separation, and police involvement prevents immigrants from accessing support or justice. This was a really significant intersection that we saw within the context of law and policy. And so, as we mentioned earlier, although there are laws in now 41 states in the United States banning FGMC, there is quite a gap between the passage of a law and the actual administration of the law because so many practicing communities are afraid to involve these legal systems. Funding is siloed in the global minority world, which is another term used for the Western world or the Northern Hemisphere, depending on how you like to frame it. So it's difficult for grassroots organizations, community-based organizations in countries where this practice occurs on a large scale to access funding because it is largely siloed in Western and European countries. And patriarchal structures across religious denominations enable the continuation of the practice. So a key example to kind of contextualize these various highlights is that lawmakers are hesitant to take a stance on FGMC when it's considered cultural or religious, which prevents survivors from accessing justice. others practice in communities, and denies the status of FGMC as gender-based violence, which allows the practice to continue. Next slide. So this section, interpersonal and communal forces of discrimination, largely centered patriarchal influence, which can be considered a system of oppression, though the effects of gender discrimination at the hands of this institution are prominent on the interpersonal level. Shaming of women's sexuality, as well as discrimination against girls and women, denial of bodily autonomy, and more are felt intimately from family and members of the community. As a cultural norm that is upheld by individual and communal obedience, this force can have a significant effect on survivors' ability to report FGMC and attain justice, as well as the ability to stop the continuation of this harmful practice. And as we can see from this participant's quote, FGMC is really closely related to other forms of gender-based violence because it is also a form of abuse used to control girls and women. And significantly, this participant, who works for an FGMC organization in Europe, has only known survivors to be subjected to at least 3 different forms of abuse. So that also speaks to the importance of looking at FGMC with an intersectional lens, because if we are trying to silo FGMC as a form of gender-based violence without looking at all of the different harms that survivors are encountering, we're really missing a lot of places where we can help. So some of the highlights from this theme include female sexuality and bodily autonomy are not acknowledged or respected. And we saw that there was a high co-occurrence of these patriarchal influences with religion and religious indoctrination. Male circumcision and female circumcision are treated very differently in the community. And this ultimately boils down to gender discrimination. And interestingly, within the FGMC sphere itself, there are strong disagreements over the framing of mutilation versus cutting. So this is a dynamic that is seen pretty consistently throughout the FGMC sphere. There are a lot of disagreements about how to not just label FGMC with the language, but also how to explain and advocate against it. So this was an interesting dynamic that we touched on in the report. And a key example from this theme would be a mother's desire not to inflict the harms of FGMC on her daughter is overridden by her husband, who believes that it is his right as head of the family to ensure his girl child, who is now 7, will remain respectable and eventually become a suitable wife. Next slide. So as we transition to the portion of this presentation on cross-collaboration, I thought it was relevant to share quantitative data from the survey on participants' beliefs of the value of cross-collaboration between the movement to end FGMC and other social justice movements. So as you can see, all 4 of the major demographic groups from the survey overwhelmingly believe that yes, there is value. Next slide. However, many participants proceeded to express various challenges in these collaborations, and fewer had concrete ideas on how to create collaborations. So issues around discrimination and legal complications were raised, as well as challenges with funding. The need for pre-collaboration education was emphasized, and these are very real barriers. But ultimately, we believe that challenges in the way of collaboration can be alchemized into opportunities. Next slide. And so in the spirit of understanding challenges in order to create opportunities, I wanted to ask you all whether you had any hesitations towards cross-collaboration in your own work, either based in past experience or anticipation. And once again, please feel free to come off of mute or type your answers in the chat box. All right, I think if there aren't any hesitations, that's maybe a good sign. So I think we can move along to the next slide. So as I mentioned, a lot of challenges were raised by survey participants, but we would like to frame challenges as precursors to opportunities. And so while folks were across the board interested in cross-collaboration and recognize the value of it, qualitative responses around this topic indicate that participants don't know where to start, which is why we're here, to figure out where those opportunities exist and collectively envision them into existence. So one participant mentioned that cross-movement funding could be difficult to come by, as collaborations may need to already be in place before applying for larger funding. And while the capacity and funding of small community-based organizations can absolutely be a hindrance to cross-collaboration, I also pose the question of whether or not collective action around shared goals, such as collaborations with larger organizations with access to more funding, can also provide an opportunity. And another participant pointed out that people think FGMC is too specific or nuanced to include in larger social justice movements, and that it might be seen as a peg of women's rights and not a movement in of itself. So I posit, what is a specific movement? Is there any movement that is too specific? And when we frame FGMC as a form of gender-based violence or domestic violence and sexual assault, does this allow us to broaden our definition of gendered violence, as well as encourage banding together with other quote unquote specific movements to create coalitions? Next slide. And in terms of opportunities, folks seem to agree that education was a really key piece, as well as mission alignment. One participant offered up a few opportunities, such as cross-movement networking and education, as well as joint social media and public awareness campaigns. And I pose these questions for you all to start thinking about as we start to transition into the discussion section of this presentation. So what are your organization's values, and how can you recognize alignment within another organization, even if different approaches or goals are in place? And when looking at collaborative programming, what can guide your search for partners? Is there a balance of strengths and weaknesses, diversity in voices, an umbrella vision? So these are some things to think about. Next slide. And in keeping with the spirit of inspiring opportunities for cross-collaboration, I thought sharing a case study on a real collaboration amongst various stakeholders might be helpful for your own brainstorming purposes. So this is a video of Orchid Poussey, who is the executive director of Asian Women's Shelter, outlining a partnership between AWS, SAO, and Story Center for the Voices to End FGMC program. Oh, it looks like it cannot be loaded. That is a shame. Well, I will definitely send that out to you all after this presentation, because I think Orchid speaks really eloquently on the different roles between the various partners in this collaboration and how each of them brings something different to the table in order to balance out each other's strengths and weaknesses. And the Voices to End FGMC program, just to quickly summarize, is one of SAO's most popular and beloved programs, in which we sponsor cohorts of survivors as well as activists to create short digital stories about their experiences around FGMC, from writing a script to developing the video to then sharing it with an audience. And we use these videos in our educational purposes in order to really bring a face and a person to educating about this topic, because I think that storytelling is a really powerful way to elicit change. So apologies for the technical difficulties, but I will definitely make sure that you all can see that later. Next slide. So as we wrap up the presentation portion of our time, we look to the future, beginning with recommendations gleaned from this report. Next slide. The SAO research team developed 8 recommendations on FGMC work specifically, as well as collaboration and intersectional approaches. And while for the sake of time, I won't go into depth on these, once again, I do encourage you all to look at the report if you're curious about how these were developed, and if you are interested in our recommendations specifically for cross-collaboration. Next slide. And in terms of the project, the last stage of our original research consisted of 30 interviews where 70% of participants worked in the FGMC sphere and over half were raised in practicing communities. And the themes of that report are similar to this one, which strengthen the body of knowledge we've already begun to accumulate. But this next report also includes more extensive insights on already established themes and touches on some themes that were not present in this report. We do expect this qualitative report to be released later this year, so I encourage everyone to stay tuned. Next slide. And we've now reached the discussion portion of our time. Our team has put together a few questions for you all to consider about this presentation and our goal of encouraging future collaborations with intersectional approaches. And we would love for you all to interact with these questions in the chat box or live. And we'll now take some time for you all to consider these questions as well as your responses. Next slide. So the first question is, how can an intersectional lens be used in your work? Followed by, have you engaged in cross-sector collaboration before? And if so, what did you learn? Where do you think collective action with other movements could be used in your approach to ending gender-based violence? And are there any hesitations that you have about partnering with other movements or sectors? So we'll give about 5 minutes for you all to interact with these questions either in the chat box. You're also welcome to come off mute, and then we'll start to wrap up the presentation. So I see this message in the chat. Is it Shobana? I want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name right. Okay, thank you. So Shobana says, I would love to see more trainings like this on the specific intersections of other movements and FGMC, paired with technical assistance for case staffing support for when folks encounter those intersections in their work. Or if this already exists, maybe we can just share that info. And Renee said, one possible cross-collaboration for dealing with the white evangelical religious groups that cut their women and girls would be to join with the anti-Christian nationalism movement that is concerned with how Christian nationalism teachings are the opposite of Jesus Christ teachings. Tiani says, in my work, it's important for me to understand the different identities of our clients They are not just DV survivors, they are part of cultures, communities, and religious communities that impact their response to their experience of DV and their healing journey. Courtney says, cross-sector collaboration and engaging in potentially unfamiliar movements takes self-work and self-reflection. Absolutely. I've noticed that the DV and to a lesser extent GBV realm is often hesitant to engage heavily in the reproductive justice sphere, particularly with anything that is directly related to sexual pleasure and reproductive autonomy. Another thought is learning from the integration of other movements into the GBV sphere, including child marriage, human trafficking, etc. And Marvy says, all forms of oppression crisscross and are mutually reinforcing, therefore they must be simultaneously opposed. Elizabeth says, as a student, intersectional lenses help me understand my fellow peers in aspects such as race, sexuality, gender, etc., in order to help create inclusive environments and help everyone feel welcome. These are all really great insights. I appreciate you very much for sharing. I'd like to just echo what Shobana says about if these technical assistance opportunities already exist. I would love to encourage anyone who is involved in this kind of work to share resources that you've created. Something that SAO is incredibly aware of and grateful for is that as we all come into this awareness of the importance of intersectionality and intersectional approaches, it is really crucial to start with that learning process and to build upon the work of those who have come before us. And so we're looking really not to just create this body of work in a vacuum, but to build on the experiences of other people and accumulate those lessons into our own teachings. So definitely want to encourage you all to share resources that you do have with each other, because I think that's incredibly important. Male supremacy is the cornerstone of society. Yep. All right, I'll just give a few more minutes for folks to put their answers into the chat, and then I think we'll move on. But thank you again to everyone who has given their wonderful insight. All right, I think that we can move on to the next slide. And so, as I mentioned, the intention for how we go forward with this is turning this data into action. So we're working to collect examples on cross-collaboration and intersectional approaches to hopefully create a toolkit for stakeholders involved in this kind of programming and work. And we're also currently engaging in community education initiatives, such as our training and technical assistance program, as well as our Voices to End FGMC program, which incorporate these intersectional approaches into our work to end FGMC. Next slide. So for anyone here who might be interested in learning more about FGMC and wants to introduce this topic more into your work or within your organizations, SAO provides training and technical assistance to educate and build the capacity of service providers and frontline professionals who might find themselves working with FGMC survivors. And these groups include GBV organizations, law enforcement agencies, schools or universities, social work agencies, healthcare providers, and more. Through these training sessions, organizations are able to better incorporate culturally responsive programming on FGMC into their work. And if you would like to get in touch with us for a workshop or presentation, please fill out our community presentation request form, or you can email Arias, who is our training and technical assistance coordinator. I'm going to provide a link for the community presentation request. And I will also provide Arias's email in case you are interested in learning more. Next slide. And finally, this last piece that we want to uplift is SAO's Voices to End FGMC podcast, which was created to promote the Voices to End FGMC program. This podcast includes frank discussions about what FGMC is and how survivors can be affected in terms of their physical and mental health, as well as their relationships, and delving deeper into the intersecting identities of individuals. Some episodes bring in guests who have acted in their capacity as partners, therapists, public health professionals, and elected officials to speak out against FGMC. If you've always wanted to know more about FGMC, or if you're wondering why, as a feminist or social justice activist, you should care about the topic, we definitely encourage you to tune into the conversations about the complex familial, cultural, and political context of their stories. And I will be including those links in the chat as well. And I see a message. Thank you so much for this offer to collaborate. We will be sending out an email afterwards with contact information and things like that. So if you all would like to stay in touch, we can definitely find a way to make that happen. Next slide. And here are the QR codes for the link to the report itself, as well as our critical intersections research page. If you all are interested in reading the report or just learning more about our research, these are the two links to do so. Next slide. And with that, I just thank you all so very much for your time, for listening to me and the hopefully not too much of the construction noises in the background. This is the contact information for our research team, including myself, Maria Taher, who is the executive director, and Arias Nuno, who is the training and technical assistance coordinator. If you are interested in learning more about SAO's research, please feel free to email me directly or visit the research page on SAO's website. And with that, next slide, I will just open it up to any questions that y'all have. So I see a question about trainings on the intersections of trafficking and FGMC. We do not do that currently, although that would be a really interesting intersection to look at. I don't know of any resources off the top of my head that look at that specific intersection, but I am going to make a note of that because that is not a topic or intersection that we have broached yet, but certainly a relevant one. Absolutely. Animal liberation is part of intersectionality. We are all intertwined in this world. Thank you, Marvi. Any other questions?
I don't see any other questions, but I see a lot of thanks in the chat for a great presentation and all the information.
All right. Well, thank you all again so much for the time. And I think if there are no questions, I'm happy to give you all back. Oh, thank you. I'm happy to give you all back a half hour of your time to enjoy this beautiful day. As I mentioned, we will be following up with the links and resources, and I will definitely ask about that intersection between FGMC and trafficking. If you all have any follow-up questions after the presentation or would like to learn more, please feel free to email me, rachel@sao.org. And I look forward to potentially collaborating with you all in the future, seeing what you all accomplish.
Thank you, Rachel, for a fabulous presentation, and Aisha for smooth behind the scenes operations. We super appreciate it. And, just thank you for to everybody here to take the time out of your busy days to, to hear and engage. I love that this approach from the intersectionality angle because I'm more familiar with, obviously DVSA than FGMC, and just through your entire presentations, I can see the overlap, and I can see the connection from the reasons behind it to a lot of the barriers, the intersections with immigration, and the just kind of all the dynamics are very familiar and are very similar. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for these cross collaborations and across all the different fields that we work in. So thank you for opening the conversation, and I hope we continue to have these conversations. If you would like to, like Rachel said, feel free to reach out to them, or you can reach out to us at API-GBV as well. And yeah, just take care and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you so much for this opportunity. Bye, all.